and moderate a panel for us. So thank you, Lettie. Really appreciate that. As I noted also earlier, we're not going to go through bios. All these folks' bios are in your program right now. But if you have questions for them, try to catch them as they're wrapping up here or something. So Lettie, I'm just going to turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you. So yes, I am Lettie. I'm the economy reporter at CalMatters, and next to me is Leticia Garcia from the California Retailers Association, and then we have Assembly Member Rhodesia Ransom, and then we have James, is it Sayre, from UC Davis. He's an assistant professor, and we have Stephen Fenaroli from the California Farm Bureau Federation, and like Rich said, everyone's bios is in the packet here. So let's get started. I just want to sort of set the stage. According to the San Francisco Federal Reserve Beige Book from April, beef prices are at historic highs. Transportation, fertilizer, and chemical costs have risen, and for some, input costs exceeded the prices producers receive for their crops. Consumers have reduced spending on things such as fruit and non-essential products, but they're still spending. So that's sort of that's how I wanted to set the stage. I wanted to ask the Assembly member, can you tell us what you've heard from your constituents in the Central Valley about the financial pressures that they're facing?
Absolutely. So first of all, thank you for the invitation to be here. This is a very important topic. So talking to constituents in the district, before people used to choose between things that they wanted and things that they needed. Now what we're hearing from constituents is they are prioritizing their needs differently. Even though they need all of the things, they need all of the foods. We have people who work every day who are now saying, well, I will go and humble myself and pick up a food box from the food bank, and take whatever they have in the food bank, because that's how they're going to get fresh produce and save dollars. So what we're hearing from constituents is, because of the affordability crisis that we are facing, it's no longer about them choosing between vacation and other needs. They're now choosing which needs to prioritize, and gas and food are at the top of the list.
Gas isn't cheap either, right? Stephen, I want to go to you. Sort of the source of our food. So what challenges are farmers facing, both at this moment, because we know that there are challenges of the moment, like the Iran war and tariffs, other things, but also generally speaking, because as we know, California is a high price state. So can you sort of talk about the challenges that farmers are facing and how that is translating to the food prices that we see?
I think you started to hit on it from the onset. We're kind of getting it from every which direction. The state, the federal government, from just outside market forces. We can start with tariffs, right? I mean, that's been incredibly interruptive to farmers who are just trying to get their product to market. When things cost more, when buyers leave the market, when they don't want to buy California crops, that's really hard to get that market back. You mentioned, beef prices. The only people that are really kind of enjoying things right now are those cattle ranchers, because they're finally kind of getting a good price. They haven't for a while. Ultimately, right, we all pay for that one way or another. But then you also mentioned it, right? Diesel's up 46% because of the Iran war. American Farm Bureau, we did a survey with them about fertilizer, and we found that 66% of farmers in the West, they can't afford fertilizer for their crops this year. That's going to leave them with one of two decisions, either, and they don't really have the opportunity to raise their prices, right? Because we sell on a global market, so you're restricted to what are your economic options. You're going to plant less. If you don't have the fertilizer, the crop protection materials to do it, you're going to farm less. We also know, we've just had, I think we're going to see the fallowing of over 600,000 acres of California grown products in the next couple of years, and that's all because of SIGMA and water restrictions. So we can get into that a little bit later. There's some work that was done last year in the legislature to go and try and find more water and to prioritize that for the state. But in reality, if there's no water, we can't grow anything. So I think maybe pause there and just say that we've got a lot on our plate, and farmers are definitely feeling the pressures kind of from every which direction.
Leticia, or Lettie, I want to go to you, sort of the next stop on the train of how our food gets to us. Can you lay out what retailers are facing, sort of keeping in mind all the things that I said to Stephen about like higher costs just piled on top of another?
Yeah, and thank you for having me here today, representing the grocery industry all throughout California. Kind of to what Stephen said, the grocery store is the last stop for all of these products. They are not necessarily the manufacturers. They don't pick all these produce. They're the folks who just sell all the items that come to them. I think Trader Joe's is the exception because they do manufacture their own food, but for the most part, all these grocery stores are trying to, well, I'm going to take a step back. When I'm talking about grocery stores, I want us to also think about the independent, medium-sized markets, because when we talk about grocery stores, I feel like we tend to look at the national brands, but we don't really put an emphasis on your local grocers, independent grocers who operate in these areas where, quite frankly, others don't want to operate in. In Assemblymember Ransom's district, which I'm from, Food for Less, Rancho San Miguel, they're an independent market. They're employee owned, and they do such good work in those areas, but they're also competing with the national brands, with the Walmarts of the world. And so it's hard for independent grocers to keep their prices low to try to compete with these larger brands, because at the end of the day, they don't have the same buying power that these larger brands have, so things are much more expensive for them. Right before this, we were just discussing a Latino market down in the Gilroy area sent me numbers on prices of her produce, and she's a Hispanic market, so she's selling staples, that my community likes. For example, Roman tomatoes. Last year, a 25-pound box, she bought it for $16. This year was $45. So now you can imagine that she makes $6-7 off of this box of tomatoes. And so when folks really want to talk about affordability and how do we not pass this on to the consumer, like, we have to understand that these grocers are doing their best to try to be competitive with everyone else in this market, because it is a competitive environment. And then sometimes they're the only grocery store in the area, so it's harder for them to get produce to them, because like in Humboldt County, we have the harvest markets, and those are the only, in Fort Bragg, they're probably one of two grocery stores that are there. And so for them, it's much more expensive to get these produce, and so that's why prices are higher there, as opposed to like an urban area. So there's a lot going on.
Have you seen any independent grocers close yet, or are close to sort of that breaking point?
Not yet. But I do, one of the uncertainties coming down is these cuts on SNAP and CalFresh that are coming down from the federal government. There is going to be, come October, probably about 1 million people who will lose their benefits. And so that's a lot of money that is not going to be circulated through the economy. And a lot of these independent grocers that they serve these communities that are mostly on SNAP benefits, on CalFresh and WIC. And so removing all that money from these communities is actually going to have a huge impact for them. We don't know what that is, because we don't know necessarily what that number looks like yet. But it is a scary thought that, come 3 months, some grocers are really going to be suffering, especially the independents. The larger brands, they can subsidize stores that are lower performing with, higher performing stores. But when you're talking about, store that has an owner operator that has 3-4 stores, that's actually a huge economic impact for them.
James, I want to go to you after hearing what Stephen and Lettie said. Can you sort of put all of this into historical perspective? Are these challenges altogether, are they unprecedented? Have you seen, can you put it in perspective for us?
Sure, absolutely. So thanks for having me first of all. So I think Steve and Lettie have hit on a lot of the sort of issues that I'm seeing as well. But I think overall, sort of the takeaways that I think in the food and agriculture sector, sort of up and down the supply chain, we're seeing really unprecedented headwinds. So take trade and tariffs, for example. If you look at, say, you can just Google it, trade policy uncertainty, sort of economists who have measured that have found that we're at unprecedentedly high sort of levels that we've never seen before in terms of sort of what policies might come about. I think everyone knows that tariffs have been sort of this on and off thing. It's very, very hard for both growers, retailers, sort of intermediaries to make decisions when they don't know sort of if I'm sourcing from X country or I'm exporting to a given sort of partner country. What is that going to look like in the future? For growers, agriculture has always been sort of a very risky industry. I mean, the sort of saying is that agriculture is basically an open air casino. But when you're sort of making these long run, sort of multi-decade sort of planning decisions, you're choosing whether or not to plant an almond orchard. That's sort of something that's going to pay off in a number of given years. You won't see sort of returns for a number of years, and then sort of it really is going to depend on what the market looks like in a decade or so. Having planning certainty is really, really important. I think all along the supply chain, it's really quite difficult to know sort of what the cost of inputs is going to be, sort of what markets you can access, things like that. There's sort of other issues that are open, obviously, sort of in right now, the really, really looming cost that sort of Stephen hit on is the price of oil, especially with the war in Iran. Diesel is used sort of basically at all stages of the supply chain, whether or not it's machinery at the farm level, whether or not it's used in the trucks that bring all of the food to market, electricity costs, energy costs that processors use. And so uncertainty in, say, what the price of nitrogen-based fertilizer, urea is going to be really difficult to sort of make planning decisions, or sort of growers are going to have to cut back on sort of their planting. So, we're really seeing uncertainty at large stages and large parts of sort of producers' input costs. Finally, there's sort of other sort of factors that, of course, are happening worldwide, including sort of the cost of energy, but climate change is a huge factor. So now this year, we basically had all of our snowpack melt in March. So surface water availability is going to be a real issue. Obviously, with sort of groundwater availability is also a huge concern with programs like Sigma. That's going to be, there are real concerns that large parts of California will have to sort of fallow land and won't be able to grow crops anymore. So those are concerns as well. And then finally, there's some issues on sort of the labor side. So there's these big changes on the federal level as to sort of what growers had to pay for sort of migrant sort of guest workers. Those sort of reduce the cost of labor sort of across the board nationwide, but they'll be more impactful in states outside of California, which has historically relied less on sort of these guest worker programs.
Stephen, it occurred to me that I want to ask you the same question that I asked Lettie, which is, are you worried about farms having to shut down? I mean, I know in the reporting that I've done, I've talked with third and fourth generation farmers who are really struggling to keep the farm that they've had in their family for generations. But they tell me that they're just struggling so much. There's just so many obstacles and challenges for them.
Short answer, yes. There's some data out that says that farmers keep, for every dollar that you spend at the grocery store, farmers keep about 5 cents of that. That's not sustainable when you look at giving incentives for, their children, for their children's children, for these sort of generational farming that we've seen in the past. I think, a couple ways I want to tackle this. That stress has been, I think, just insurmountable. I mean, year over year, we see a lot of farm deaths, and we see, May being Mental Health Awareness Month. There's just the impact that is on a farmer who's had this farm in his family, in their family for generations, and now they can't pay their bank loan, or, they've run out of market for their crop, or they had a bad crop year and they still need to service their loan. What's that person left to do? And there's a lot of people who turn to kind of that worst case scenario. And so we're looking at trying to, there's a lot of people out there doing the same, but how can we give our 23,000 farm and ranch members across the state some resources around there? I think, also around your question, there's just consolidation. So these small farms aren't able to handle a lot of the regulatory costs that the state, the feds, the county, every layer is getting imposed on them. And so maybe they're still in business, but they sell to somebody else who's bigger, larger, and they can absorb a lot of that compliance work that mom and pop farm operation can't they just can't deal with. But I think there is, and the one other thing I was going to mention was, Del Monte Foods is a staple in California, and they just went out of business. They said they're going to file for bankruptcy. That left their cannery in Modesto to close, and that left a lot of peach growers with nowhere to send their fruit. And that's that sort of thing where, as James talks about that certainty, that's what farmers and ranchers, they rely on when they build their business plans. It's not for 6 months, it's not for a year, it's for these multi-generational time periods where they're looking at putting in permanent crops. And so they're looking at it and saying, well, we don't have, in some case, water. In this case, we don't have a buyer for our product. They've been able to source some of the peaches to another processor, but really that's going to mean pulling those peaches out of the ground and planting something else. So I think that's the optimistic note that I'm left with is, and I hate to say this piece. Everyone always likes to say, oh, farmers are so resilient. And they are, but gosh, there's only so much people can take before they just throw in the towel and they say, hey, enough's enough. I'm not going to do this. My kid doesn't want to do this. They're going to go get a good paying job, somewhere else in the state. They're not going to stick around, the Central Valley or Northern California that have some different jobs. So I'm optimistic that these farmers transition into that next stage of what their farm looks like to keep farming. But again, kind of my word of caution, my concern is that when is enough enough?
Assemblymember Ransom, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, all these different pressures are coming from everywhere, but a lot of it is beyond the states. What state lawmakers can do. How are you trying to address what you can at the state level?
That's a great question. So I think it's already been kind of alluded to that a lot of we already were having struggles in California with affordability. However, what's happening at the federal level has really added multiple layers. So as we're looking at all of these crises with affordability, now we look at the healthcare crisis. And so you'll see in California, we went from having solid plans and making sure that we can take care of everyone to now we're really scrambling to fill in holes that are created by things like HR1 and healthcare affordability, which impacts a lot of people in the state of California. The situation that we have with SNAP and making sure that we are funding food banks more than we've ever funded them before, and making sure that we're coming in ways to support those industries that are now struggling to be able to continue the work that they're doing. Our farmers have been hit also really hard with the federal cutbacks and the federal regulatory changes as well. And that really hurts the small farming community a lot more than it hurts like the bigger commercial farms. And to be honest, it actually hurts everyone. So you see us all kind of, it's not even a partisan fight. You know, we have these public partisan discussions, but at the end of the day, we're all trying to figure out what do we do as Californians to backfill. And that means we have to make changes with our budget. It's also really important that we revisit some of the regulatory things. You'll see that a lot of the legislators recently, we pushed back on CAR's proposal. Like we get it. We really appreciate your ambition because I think we all do care about, you know, environment, and we all do care about, you know, sustainability. We know that climate change is real, but in an environment like what we're facing right now with affordability, it's important that we ask our regulators to take another look. We're asking, you know, our utilities, take another look when it comes to inflation. Do you really need, just like the families are choosing what they have to prioritize, as a state, we're asking our agencies to figure out what we need to prioritize because we know that ultimately that cost is going to get passed down to consumers. And so we have to make sure that we're doing our part to not only fill in the gaps, but to slow down some of the impacts that we have. And then lastly, I'll say it's also really important that we realize that the policies that we have are kind of put one policy on another year after year. And then we need to go do some cleanup work to figure out where we have lost effectiveness and where we've added unnecessary costs.
Would you say that in the legislature right now, there's a lot of sort of compromising? In the previous panel about energy costs, they sort of touched on that. Would you say that there's a lot more compromising than there used to be because of the affordability questions and issues?
Absolutely. And I think a lot of that in the last year was very evident when you saw people who were like hardcore enviros vote on things because they know that we're at a crisis point with things like our refineries, and ultimately that cost is going to get pushed down to consumers. And you see people being a little more creative and innovative and open to discussions. I absolutely see that happening.
I wanted to ask basically just anyone on the panel about the food bank question, because as we know, there has been, you know, like there have been cuts in federal funding to food banks, and that affects not just the end receiver of the food that food banks distribute, but but farms and grocers. Can you guys sort of talk about that, what's going on there?
Yeah, so the grocery industry has always been great partners with the food banks that they operate in. You know, they have seen an uptick in donations ever since, you know, COVID, because there was a lot of external factors. But most recently, during the last government shutdown, when the federal government decided to not distribute SNAP benefits, here in California, they went without benefits for 5 days, which is that general timeline that benefits are distributed. It was a crisis mode. I was on the phone every day, like talking to grocers, like, what do I do? Can I offer this? Can I do that? I'm like, oh, you're kind of constrained because of, you know, what the federal requirements are for this. So they just started, you know, donating a lot more to food banks because in other food donation programs, not just necessarily, you know, in the food bank system, but there was just so much need. And even when, you know, several states sued the federal government and the federal government had to use their contingency funds to backfill the SNAP benefits, the grocery stores saw that folks were not using their full benefits, right? And so they generally rely on historical purchasing patterns for all their inventory that they purchase. And they saw that a lot of folks were buying more shelf-stable items, not necessarily the fresh fruits and produce that, you know, we would want folks to purchase. And then they were subsidizing, or not subsidizing, but, you know, complementing they were saving those benefits and going to food banks to help with, you know, alleviate some of those cost burdens, because they didn't know if next month they would have those benefits. And so the food banks are a very, very integral part of our food system. But I think there should be an emphasis to not have them be a big part of our food system, right? Because when you have so many people going to these food banks, that means there is a crisis. That means that there are folks who are not finding, that can't afford to purchase, whatever it is that they want, and they're going to these food banks, getting boxes. I volunteer here at the River City Food Bank, and they do an excellent job of providing options to folks who are mostly refugees in the St. Matthew's Church. And but at the end of the day, there's some foods that they don't know how to cook because it's it's not within in their culture. It's not culturally appropriate. And like oatmeal, someone came up to me and asked me how to cook oatmeal. And, for us, that's, here in California, Americans, it's a staple item. And she didn't know how. So, I had to explain to her. And so it's things like that we want the food banks to still be partners, but we don't want them to see them serve as many people as they're serving right now, because that just means there's something happening and there's something wrong within our system.
I can add there, the farm bill, which we're waiting on, year 3 of it getting passed. We haven't seen one passed since the reauthorization was due in 2023. 80% of the farm bill is SNAP. And so that's the sort of thing where when people don't have that certainty, when we're kind of, using them as bargaining tools and chips and stuff at the federal level, that hurts the, people who need it the most. I think, I hope that if we were all to raise our hand in this room and ask who wants to eat California grown produce, commodities, crops, my hope is that everyone here would raise their hand. And that's, I think, my guess is also our collective goal up here is how do we continue to make sure that everything grown in California makes its way to somebody and that anybody who wants a meal gets a meal. I think when I sit down with legislators and I ask them and I say, hey, don't think about me when you're passing this legislation, but think about that, family of 3, 4 who, is on SNAP, they can't afford different types of foods. Think about them when you're passing some of this legislation, because that's who it's going to most impact when the grocery bill starts going up. Back to Lettie's point, when jalapenos cost more, when tomatoes cost more, when everything starts costing more, there's a group of people who can absorb those costs, and there's a group of people who can't absorb those, and then they turn to food banks, and they serve a fantastic purpose, and we try to be as good of partners with them as we can. But to Lettie's point, there's more going on, and I think we need to look at fixing the problem and not just one of the later symptoms.
And I'll just kind of add on kind of some of how this is impacting us in the legislature. You all may have saw that the budget committee run by Dr. Jackson had to do a huge contribution to food banks across the state. And this is because we're seeing, that uptick. There's currently a letter of budget asset or a policy we're working on with Assemblymember Pellerin, which is a food purchase assistance program, which would basically invest in food banks so that they can have the dollars to purchase directly from our local farmers and markets at market rate, not asking people who are already struggling to donate to the food banks, but saying, look, we were going to give the food banks the ability to purchase directly this fresh produce locally at market rate, because we do understand that this is a domino effect to our economy, what's happening right now. And so, we have to make sure that when we're putting money into the food banks, that the food banks are supporting the farmers, because we want everyone to be able to weather this storm right now.
I want to ask James, when prices go up, do they generally come back down? And, well, yeah, why don't I start with that?
Sure. Well, I think it really depends on sort of the nature of these sort of cost shocks all along the supply chain, whether or not we expect them to be temporary or permanent. I think some would just sort of have a secular increase over time. Inflation generally sort of goes up. But in general, there is this sort of phenomenon when sort of costs sort of accrue along the supply chain, they tend to sort of get realized more immediately to consumers than, say, price decreases. So when the cost of, say, food production come down, generally takes a lot longer for those sort of prices to come down. And the way you might think about it, and the way sort of economists have thought about it, is that, particularly now when gas prices are rising, I usually wouldn't sort of drive around town to look for the lowest price of gas. Now I'm looking around a little bit more these days. I think we all are. But when prices come down, consumers are a little bit less sort of sensitive or sort of aware that prices have come down, and so sort of tend to not shop around as much as when prices are increasing. And so generally, when those sort of costs come down, it takes a lot longer to sort of see sort of those costs show up in terms of lower grocery bills. But of course, it sort of depends. When we think about the cost shocks that are sort of looming here, the war in Iran has cost shocks that, quite frankly, haven't even been fully materialized yet. And so, a lot of times, say, airlines, transportation providers, freight, they sort of will buy futures on the price of oil. And so that's to sort of insulate them from exactly when shocks like this happen. They get locked into contracts where they agree to sort of provide transportation services, and then they don't want to sort of be on the hook for sort of providing services that are under cost when the price of diesel or fuel goes up. And so a lot of the times, particularly say in the transportation sector, it takes a couple of months to sort of really see the sort of pass through of these into transportation rates, because a lot of these contracts are locked in. And we're looking at right now what one of my colleagues in my department has described as like the largest shock to oil prices in our lifetime. And so that, when the price of fuel gets embedded both in transportation, the cost of production, it's going to be a really long, persistent shock that unfortunately we're going to see, but it's going to sort of roll in slowly and keep ratcheting things up. So unfortunately, my projection is that prices are just going to, we should expect them to keep going up quite drastically.
I feel like he just told me I'm never gonna see a $3 egg again.
Actually, eggs are like the only thing cheap right now. So buy eggs, like buy egg futures. Like I've got people who it's coming out of their ears at this point.
I wanted to ask, I know that I think the Trump administration announced in December like a $12 billion bailout for farmers. Have California farmers seen any of that? And if so, how much has that helped?
So we don't grow a lot of row crops here. So a lot of that's going to go to corn, soy, a lot of those, Title I crops. We don't grow a lot of that here, and I'm very grateful for that, because we grow over 400 specialty commodities in the state of California, and I love every single one of them equally. Don't tell any of my members otherwise. But no, we won't see a lot of that, and it's the power of the Midwest, and it's the power of corn growers, and that they get to say, oh, well, you need to help us out in this trade dispute. So again, unfortunately, we're not going to see a lot. There's some stuff we might get around forage, alfalfa, some other pieces that are not coming to my mind right now, but it was going to be in the tune of, maybe hundreds of million, but definitely nothing with a B, no billions.
If I can interject, I mean, just echoing your points, California has been really disadvantaged. We produce 32% of the nation's sort of agriculture by value, and just thinking about things like produce, 60% in terms of quantity. And yet, sort of federal policy, because of the nature of the way that, say, Senate representation works, we have 2 senators. If you look at the Midwest, they've got 16, 20, depending on how you count it. And so they're really, really influential in advocating for, say, farmer assistance programs, like these sort of bridge payments that you're sort of referring to, or in the previous sort of trade war with China, market facilitation program payments. And they're really, really effective in advocating for programs that basically systematically give much more sort of assistance to sort of row crops, to these sort of Midwest growers, than they do to specialty crop growers here in California. And I think federal policy is really, really targeted towards those states.
I'll add to that. I mean, they're doing Farm Bill markup right now. I mean, they did it yesterday. And I'm incredibly grateful to our federal partners. I mean, Representative Adam Gray from Merced, he was able to get his amendment for the specialty crop block grant program back in, and that helps market access for our commodities across the board. So, across parties, we have advocates, and they're just, I can't begin to thank these are representatives enough for giving the attention that California deserves. We're the #1 ag state by a mile. Now, I would offer that's not what the farmer actually keeps of that. We gross about $60 billion in ag products. The farmer is not seeing that 60 billion, right? It is way, way lower. So I don't want to confuse the two. And obviously I want, as many ag products coming out of California. I want that. But again, we get into the conversation about high prices. And one of the comments, probably at the end of last year was that went from like 60 to 61 billion. Is that new $1 billion? Is that because of inflation? Or is it because we're actually growing and exporting more? And those are the sort of things that farmers have to contend with, is just that inflation side and not actually seeing every dollar at the farm gate.
Speaking of exporting, I wonder how much U.S. trade policy tariffs, I wonder how much that has put a strain on California agricultural exports, and then how that then relates to how much farmers are struggling here.
Yeah, so California is the second most exposed state to sort of exports. So about 40% of sort of all sort of farm products are exported abroad here in California, only behind Hawaii, which is a much smaller state in terms of agricultural production. And so, growers here in the state are really, for lots of these products, like almonds, they're really, really heavily exported. And so we need to increase domestic consumption almost 5 times to make up for the sort of loss of export markets. And so a lot of these crops that are grown here in California, they really, really are dependent on both export market access, but also sort of continued, assurance that they'll be able to access those markets in the future. And one of the sort of things that we've all sort of learned through the last year, or last couple of last year in particular, is that trade is a manifestation of America's soft power to a certain extent. And so trade is built on sort of alliances, on negotiations, on long-standing sort of agreements. And if you sort of say, okay, we're going to rip those up tomorrow, it really takes a long time to sort of build those relationships back up. It's not going to sort of, we're not going to have another administration come along and then suddenly we're sort of re-exporting these products back to, say, China. So some of my colleagues have looked at the losses here in California, and the loss of basically sort of exports to China in particular has come at a loss of basically, just in the last year, of $1 billion. That's huge in terms of, if you're thinking about $60 billion, that's quite large, and that's just sort of one market. Take Canada, for instance, where, say, the wine industry has historically had a large amount of exports to Canada. And then you go into Canadian supermarkets. I was in Canada last year. They'll have flags now showing where the product is from.
Yeah, they're boycotting U.S. wines.
And that's not actually a policy. They do have they have slapped tariffs on some American exports. That's obviously hurting as well. But a lot of it is actually just based on relationships. If Canadians don't want to buy American products due to some of the sort of increased sort of aggression or perceived aggression from the U.S. side, then that's also going to affect sort of our producers, who are going to be hurt by them sort of boycotting our products. So lots of headwinds there.
I think, is it time for audience questions? I want to make sure are we good?
Unless you're ready to go.
Oh, no, well, actually, can I just ask the Assembly member one more question and then?
Oh, please do. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, so everything we've talked about here, I sort of want to go back to a question that I asked you before, and sort of just ask you to go into a little bit more detail. What can the state do to help lower prices?
I think we need to be cognizant that pretty much everything affects the end user's price. Anything that we do that impacts gas will have a consequence at the price. Utility rates, we have to rein in and find a way. That doesn't mean we forget about wildfire mitigation or any of those things, but we have to be really mindful to when we make decisions on how they are going to impact the end users. And I kind of spoke a little bit about, how we're being mindful with food banks, how that will affect our farmers, but all of our regulations have consequences. And so it's really important that we are mindful of that. And I do think that some of us, I've been here this is my first term, but there's a conversation happening right now about what we need to revisit as it relates to affordability and what we need to do to test the effectiveness of some of the policies. And in different environments and in a time, of time ago, some of those things that we do now may have been okay, but now we have to make better, smarter choices when it comes to our prices and how we are impacting everything from commuters, people trying to get to their jobs. That's really an impact. When we're looking at families and their housing costs, that's an impact. And we're looking at people like our farm workers, and they can't afford their housing, and even our farmers can't afford to keep their farms. And so what are we doing to impact the taxes? And so at the end of the day, I'm saying all of this to say that every decision that we make has a cost associated with it, and we have to find out if these costs are necessary. I will say that I've had people tell me recently, including my daughter. My daughter's in North Carolina, and she's enjoying a 3-bedroom home for $1,400 a month for rent, right? But she's still like, I thought I was going to live here, but I really want to come back to California. Where we are lucky is that people will rather, pay a nice price they don't want to leave California. We can say all we want to say, but people don't want to leave California. But we still have to do everything we can to make it affordable,
Thank you.
You have time if if you have more questions, go ahead.
Okay, yeah.
I don't want to upstage the Assemblywoman, but on that front, California is the only state in the country that you cannot have an autonomous tractor. So we can have Waymo cars driving in Sacramento, we can have them driving in San Francisco, but you can't have a tractor alone out in a field by itself, running its program. So we talk about ways to make it easier to farm and easier for the farmer and the farm worker. Let's get autonomous tractors in the state.
Are we seeing a bill in the making right here?
Well, you didn't stage me. You kind of brought up some of the issues that sometimes California, we love to be innovative and we love to be first and we love to be the best, but sometimes when being the only one is not the best thing, right? So I have a bill right now. California is the last state left that does not allow the E85, which is the 85% ethanol, gas conversion kits. And that's not a first we should be proud of. And part of our issue is that we have to go through the California Air Resource Board, which has somehow found a way to not approve any of the requests for these conversion kits. So I have a bill right now that will say these things are legal because this is another option for people who, can use flex fuel by converting their cars according to the list that's already approved through the EPA. So I don't disagree with you. Being first is not always being best.
Lettie, do you have any requests for the Assembly member?
How long do we have? Well, I can say that probably some of the largest cost to a grocery store operator is energy, because they have refrigeration, they have their freezers, they have just where they store all their produce as well, and so that is a big cost. And then they have to upgrade their systems very soon because of mandates that they have to go into more renewable, the gases that are used. I'm not an expert in this, but the gases that are used in their refrigerants, that for a larger scale grocery store, they could probably do that. But for a smaller one, that's like millions of dollars that they have to save up to, change out these refrigeration systems that, quite frankly, if you're making $3 on a box of tomatoes, it's going to be hard to get that. And then the second part is we're a very litigious state. I would request no private right of actions on anything. And I know that's controversial, but I mean, that is one of their highest costs too. I talked to a grocer who has a line item in their budget, and it is the third largest line item in their budget for litigation and settlements. And so, and every year it keeps increasing. So imagine, and we're talking about millions of dollars that they are setting aside in order to be able to actually just settle, because they can't even go to court because they can't, there's no use, not no use, but they can't fight some of these things that they're getting sued on, because even if they win and they know they're right, they cannot recoup those attorney fees. And so they would just rather settle out of court because it's cheaper than going through the whole process, and then they win, but then they still have to, you know, carry that bill. So, I mean, energy, litigation, that those are probably the higher things that they have. And, you know, the legislature really loves their private right of action, and that really, for the smaller grocer, that is really what gets them. And so, you know, that's money that they're not that they're wasting, but they're spending that could be used in their stores for their employees. That means, you know, they're settling out of court for, you know, $5,000. That's a bonus that cannot be paid out to their employees, or that's a refrigeration unit, new shopping carts, you know, more lighting in their parking lots, all these things that accumulate that they can't reinvest into their communities or their stores or their employees, because they just have to pay things out. And so, I mean, that I have more, but you know, those are those are the top two that I hear from you know, the grocery community: energy and litigation. I mean, I'm going to say something else controversial, but there is.
We're okay with controversy.
A lot of these grocery operators, I mean, they're walking their stores, right? They're, you know, making very low profit margins, and there's not a grocery bros, you know, where they're riding around in like Royces or Bentleys, which a lot of people like to villainize some grocery stores like that. But these independent grocers, I mean, one of them I know drives a Ford Fiesta. But then we have folks who are in the Paga space, which we have done some work on Paga, but there's someone who drives a Rolls Royce that says Mr. Paga on it. And so it's like, there's a big disconnect. And so I'm sorry, that's controversial, but it's things like that that really make things hard for grocery operators continue in this state. I have heard some of them that have stores in other states, like, if I could move my business out of here, I would, because Oregon and Nevada, way better to do business than here in California.
That's interesting, because as you know, as has been said on this panel, I mean, there is so much to love about California, and people don't want to leave; we want to stay. But I think we are ready for audience questions.
Sure, we'll take some. I'm going to do a little prog. I'm going to ask the first one here, just because, Stephen, this is actually you. You mentioned the Farm Bill. The House just passed it, I don't know, about an hour and a half ago. Can you maybe address that just a little bit? I know it still has to go to the Senate. What does this mean if it does get through the Senate and to the President? What does this mean for California agriculture?
Well, I mentioned the specialty crop block grant piece, which is, I think, a really critical component for us. And, you know, there were, I want to say, at least yesterday in the markup, there were maybe 13 Democrats that voted for it. And so, again, we're just appreciative of all of our congressional partners. The Farm Bill, you know, for those not aware, so the Farm Bill gets reauthorized every 5 years. We were supposed to see one in 2023 for, I think, the 2024 year, and, you know, we're 2 years delayed at this point. So again, that goes to fund SNAP, that goes to fund a lot of the programs that USDA, you know, FSA, a lot of these like farm service agencies, the US Department of Agriculture work on fund. So a lot of these lifelines, a lot of these bridges for farmers, and it goes all the way to like technical assistance for different pieces of agriculture. So, I mean, it's a pretty encompassing piece, but we also mentioned that it has a lot of SNAP in it. And there's a reason they're tied together, because one constituency cares about kind of the agriculture side, and the other constituency tends to care about the SNAP side. And there's no reason why they shouldn't be tied together. It's unfortunate that, I guess last year, you know, they got split apart and we're kind of, fighting this dual effort. The Senate's going to be a different beast. I think it's going to be hard to get to 60 votes, and everybody's got their different priorities. I guess I'd say I'm cautiously optimistic.
Sorry, follow up. Prerogative.
Can I add something?
What happens if it doesn't? Well, please go ahead, and then
Anyone
what
else?
happens if it
You're welcome to chime in.
doesn't get in the
Just
Senate?
one, thing that is in the farm bill that, on the grocery end, we are concerned is that they are trying to do a nationwide SNAP restriction on sodas. And then there is also a piece, an amendment in there to do a study of how, because of the whole MAHA movement and everything that's happening on the federal level, there is also a piece in there to do a nationwide study on restricting some items on SNAP, which is, at the end of the day, there's a lot of dignity that goes into these SNAPs programs, because we want folks to be able to purchase whatever they want. They have a right just like everyone else. And so those are just two problematic things that we're concerned about. I know it's good for you, but there's also some amendments that have been pushed in there that are, just kind of worrisome for not only the grocery community, but food advocates who are working with a lot. So I'm gonna throw that out there too.
I'm sorry, just really quick. What happens? You said it's going to be tough in the Senate. What happens if it doesn't?
We're right
We
back
just
where we
start
were
all
2
over?
years ago. Yeah, and we go back to the same place. And I think it's going to be hard for House Republicans and Senate Republicans to go back to their districts in November and not have anything to show for it. So it's on them ahead of the midterms to get some actual progress made.
Okay, I promise you we are going down to audience questions, but you've had your hand up here. Same
I have
thing.
another question.
Please do not try taking the microphone out of my hand.
I just want to say one thing on the autonomous tractors. I'm afraid for farmer wives, because if she goes, if something happens to her, he'll say, well, the autonomous tractor did it. But my question is on recharging wells. I thought when they brought recharging wells was supposed to be an antidote for water shortages and to help bring back opening farming acreage based on that water. Has that changed?
We've seen a lot of really good success in recharge, and the governor 2.5 years ago, maybe, he kind of started things with an executive order, and then we've seen some legislation around trying to ease what it takes to actually make recharge happen, because in California, it's hard to put water in the ground, let alone take it out. So it's helped, but it hasn't. We're still, SIGMA is this giant beast, and there's still a lot of aquifers and basins that are non-compliant at this point. And so there's a long way to go to get, I think, to a stable place with SIGMA.
We're going to go on that side of the room.
This might be in the prerogative, whose prerogative one too,
Okay.
so I might take the microphone.
Well, they are your microphones.
I'm paying for this microphone. So I'd like to ask about some labor questions. In particular, back in a prior life when I was in the assembly, there was ag overtime that was a big subject of debate. There have been discussions about minimum wage in the last several years in fast food and elsewhere across California. Can you say a little bit more about that cost pressure on you? And an additional one that we haven't heard in this conversation so much is theft. And 2 years ago, we probably would have been talking about how much, and this is particularly to retailers and grocers, theft was an issue. So I'll let you pick which of those two to address, if not both.
So I can jump in on the labor side. So a colleague and I, Ali Hill at Berkeley, have sort of looked at the demographics of who is a farm worker. And in general, farm workers have been getting older and older. And that's true both in sort of domestic farm workers as well as farm workers who have historically come from Mexico. So the vast majority of farm workers in California originally came from Mexico. And so sort of there's big challenges on sort of who is going to supply that labor in the future. That was sort of where we're going to need to think about in the future. As to sort of questions about sort of overtime, in general, there is a bunch of concerns about California changed overtime laws, which my colleague basically found, although they're sort of well-intentioned, actually reduced sort of total wages that farm workers were bringing home. And so when we're thinking about things like, I think a lot of the times sort of regulators here have the sort of right idea, paying farm workers more, they are critical workers. It is not sort of, it comes out of growers' pockets, but paying them more is sort of, they do benefit from that. But making sure that these policies are sort of well designed and not sort of inadvertently actually hurting those same farm workers that they're designed to help is sort of really, really important. At the federal level, this change that I was alluding to earlier sort of reverts basically sort of the wages that we have to pay to sort of migrant or sort of temporary farm workers sort of back to state minimum wages. And so now basically we have to, I think the state of California is going to have to do some reckoning as to sort of, particularly as the demographics of farm workers are changing, as we almost assuredly will have to bring in more migrant workers in the future as sort of farm workers are aging out. There's going to be questions around sort of as they migrant, sort of temporary farm workers become a larger share of California's labor supply, sort of what wages they're going to make. In general, if you look at, say, wages in California compared to what they are in say, Mexico, which is historically been the source for most of the labor on California farms, they're between sort of 10 and sort of 12 times higher. And so basically all that is to suggest is that regardless of the wage we set, people will be willing to supply labor. And so there's really a question of sort of whether or not we sort of need to sort of increase wages to sort of incentivize people to continue working in agriculture, especially migrant workers.
All right, we got a question over here.
Actually, one topic for two of the panelists, starting with you, Steve, right? Yeah, and then Assemblymember Ransom. You mentioned about the bankruptcy with Del Monte, which is down in Central Valley, the Modesto area. How critical that is to that community alone, as far as the job and the economies, and does it stretch up to your community as well, community Ransom?
I guess I would just say, I mean, it's all interconnected, right? Like you look at, okay, the employees at that one facility in Modesto, they might be there. They're probably in outlying areas. You get the trucking companies who they come from all over. They go pick up, as far north, let's say Yuba City, even further. You're going to get the mechanics who aren't going to be working on those trucks anymore. You're going to get the fuel companies that aren't, selling fuel anymore. I mean, this sort of thing reverberates in these communities, and again, Modesto's it's pretty resilient. It's I'm going to say it's larger than some other cities, but this sort of thing impacts, and we have not seen the end of what it's going to do, to hurt some of these. I'm going to say Central Valley, but it's the whole Sacramento Valley in general.
It absolutely does hurt. San Joaquin County is very, very much connected to Stanislaus County, and also for the Del Monte, there is they have an administration that they do out of San Joaquin County, and so what we're seeing is a loss of head of household jobs, right? And we're already a community that has to do heavy commuting, and so my fear is that we're losing head of household jobs faster than we are creating head of household jobs, which means that's more people commuting who are dealing with the high price of gas at the same time that they're commuting. They can't always afford the electric car. So there are all of these like associated things that happen when we lose a staple in our community that maybe it's not the most glamorous work, right, that everyone wants to do, but it definitely does take care of families. We've seen people raise their families on those wages.
Just to Assemblywoman Baker's question,
No,
I think
do
that
not take the microphone.
I want to interrupt, and I think that farm work is some of the hardest, most backbreaking work out there, and it gets a bad reputation from people. And we all, I'm going to again generalize, would be at a loss without farm workers. So they deserve our, just immense appreciation.
By the way, I was reminded that these are actually not the UC's microphones. These are Eric's microphones. Sorry, Eric. No disrespect intended.
Hi, my name is Marcos Lopez. I'm with the UC Davis Labor Community Center. Thanks for the panel. It's a great conversation. So one of the things I wanted to point out too is the food affordability crisis that we're living in right now is not something that happened because of HR1. It's not happened post-COVID. It's been happening for quite a bit of time. So for instance, here in Sacramento County, we've lost roughly 18% of our farmland over the past 20 years. And so what does that look like? Take the city of Sacramento, that's how much farmland we've lost in that period of time. Okay. At the same time, we've also transitioned more towards tradable crops. So for instance, the largest crop that we produce, or the most valuable crop that we produce here in Sacramento County, are wine grapes, right? Where are we at with that now? So part of the situation is we can't feed our own people, and at the same time our population has grown quite a bit, right? We've also been doing work at the center on CalFresh usage rates. And what we've seen in the CalFresh usage rates is, we tend to focus more on metropolitan areas, but in rural California, CalFresh usage rates is really high. So take, for instance, Lake County, 1 in 4 folks in Lake County use CalFresh. They rely on that for food security. In some places like Yuba County, 30% of youth under the age of 18 are using CalFresh.
I'm sorry to cut in, but
Yeah.
we're almost out of time. Can you get to a question?
Yeah.
I want these guys to be able to respond before we have to wrap it.
Sorry, I could talk all day. My question is CalFresh is an indication that folks are not unemployed, because most people who are out using CalFresh are employed. What they are is underemployed or getting poor wages. So in thinking about that, is what is your solution for getting people the wages they deserve, to people to not have to use CalFresh? And the second piece to this is the changes to the AWR, which is what you're referring to, is going to allow for more usage of farm workers from outside the United States, from Mexico. In some counties in California, such as Sonoma and in Santa Barbara County, folks are saying that this is going to displace farm workers. And if it displaces farm workers, then that means perhaps we're using more CalFresh. So I wanted just to get a sense of kind of what is your assessment of that as well too. So 2 questions, sorry.
Well, on the grocery side, again, I want to emphasize that there are very thin profit margins for all these grocers. I also want to point out that the grocery store is probably one of the only retail businesses where you see folks retiring from. They're there for many, many years because they are very well taken care of. I worked down in Stockton in a single operator. There were 2 brothers who had 1 grocery store. When I first started there, they had 2 people retire, and it's just them on their own. And they get great benefits. They paid 25 cents extra if I worked on a Sunday. And, they try their best to, give the wages that their workers deserve, but they also have to make sure that they keep the lights on, that they also pay themselves, that, they can purchase more products. So I think it's a very difficult question to answer, because it's not just the wages that are paid, but it's also the environment that California is. Like, we have very high, very high rents. Like that's not something that the grocery store is, that wasn't their fault. We have high gas prices, that's not the grocer's fault. And so I think, the grocery community tries their best to ensure that their workers are paid fairly. But you have to take in consideration low profit margins, and they have to keep their lights on, and they want to keep those stores open. And it's a tough business to be in, and not a lot of people do it.
Yeah, I'm gonna quickly try to, you asked us a lot of things, so really quickly. So one of the things that I wanna make sure is that we prioritize California when we talk about wine grapes and things like that are being torn out. The wine industry is struggling, and that definitely impacts the Central Valley. So I have a bill that is, if you're gonna call a wine American, it needs to be 100% American. That benefits California. Yeah, right? It benefits California because 80% of the wine grapes in the US come from California. We also need to not incentivize people being underemployed. So there's a bill going through right now that would allow people who are on CalWorks program or CalFresh. Right now, they're limited to how many hours they can work. We want them to get into full-time employment. So we're gonna raise that cap. So we're not incentivizing people saying, well, I can only work 20 hours a week, so I can't go get another job. We have policies that really incentivize people being underemployed. And then we also have to raise the cap in some places where people are too poor to get things on their own, but to make too much to qualify for different programs because the programs haven't caught up with the inflation. So there's a lot of working class, hardworking people that cannot afford things. And so we're also working to change that as well. So I just wanted to touch on some of those issues.
And with that, we are going to wrap it up because thank you very much. What a great panel. Lunches are out there. We need to have time for them to redo this for the keynote, which is going to start in about 12 minutes. So please go get your lunch. It's a freebie.